Hello, comrades. Today we were going to talk about Memory by H.P. Lovecraft, but I was reading the introduction to Memory, and it said it was a prose poem inspired by some of the prose poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. I don't really know what a prose poem is, so that felt like a good thing to explore. So into one of the stories that was cited is an inspiration as a prose poem inspiration for Memory by Edgar Allan Poe, The Conversation of Eiros and Charmion. And so the interesting thing is there doesn't really seem to be consensus about whether either Memory itself was a prose poem. I looked it up. A lot of people refer to it as a short story, or whether this, The Conversation of Eros and Charmion, is a prose poem as well. It does seem to mostly be listed as a short story, but there was one collection of poetic works by Edgar Allan Poe where it was listed as one of 6 prose poems without explanation, at least from what I could see. And so for a moment I thought maybe this really wasn't a prose poem at all, because it doesn't really seem that poetic to me. However, I did find that Edgar Allan Poe wrote a 70 odd page number prose poem called Eureka, and he actually put it in the subtitle. So it's Eureka, a prose poem, and it seems more like an essay. That's a great topic for another day. So I think Edgar Allan Poe has a different idea of what a prose poem would look like than I do. And so, I'm a little bit confused by this. Of course, it's an oxymoron. Prose is one thing, and poetry, a poem, is another thing. I mean, it's a contradiction of terms. You can't have both prose and poetry. But it does seem hard to really narrow down a strict definition, an objective definition, to be able to tell when something is poetry or not. My sense is that historically poetry is much older than prose. It, of course, is linked to the oral tradition. You have songs, you have poems, you have, like those rhymes children always tell, as part of a game, or nursery rhymes. So things like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, or ring around the rosy, or the spoon jumped over the moon, I think it is. And so poetry does seem much older, and then I think we get a lot of dialogues, and prose kind of seems to directly follow from dialogue. Instead of just having 2 people talking to each other, now it's 1 person talking. But it does really seem like there wasn't a lot of first-person narrative that was written in prose, or even third-person narrative written in prose that was fictional, until, honestly, relatively recently. I think in most of the history of literature, it is, for the most part, poetry or dialogue in plays was a later development. And then around like the 1500s or so, we start getting things like Don Quixote, which is often considered the first novel. And so I'm looking at this story and I'm trying to figure out what in it could be so poetic as to move it out of the realm of just prose, or even poetic prose. I think we often, admit that prose can be poetic. You can read something and go, oh wow, that sounds awfully poetic, even though if the work itself isn't a work of poetry. The thing is actually interesting. It's written as a dialogue between 2 characters, Eiros and Charmion, who have recently died. But these aren't their names, they're their new names. So Eiros begins saying, why do you call me Eiros? Charmion, so henceforth will you always be called. You must forget too my earthly name, and speak to me as Charmion. And so these 2 characters kind of have a little bit of a back and forth. Charmion's been dead for much longer, and, wants to know if they were mourned. I think she wants to know if she was mourned, and so she asks, basically what happened. There was some kind of calamity. And so we move from this dialogue, which seems kind of fantasy, we're dealing with the afterlife, into a very long monologue by Eiros. It's about 3 pages here, a little bit more, and the story is 5 pages. So the majority of the story is dedicated to this monologue, where Eiros is talking, describing how the world ends, and it switches to, honestly, what feels more like science fiction. They didn't quite have that genre then, where they're talking about how an asteroid came. And so the scientists at first thought, wasn't going to hit the Earth, and then it became clear that it was going to hit the Earth, but it was okay because it was much lighter. It was very gaseous. However, the problem is the gas of the meteor, the comet, although it might be lighter, it ended up destroying the atmosphere and killing everyone. It's an apocalyptic story. And so it's this weird dialogue, monologue, fantasy sci-fi story. And I'm thinking, why is this prose poetry? And I think the reason I might have trouble accepting this is prose poetry is not because of my conception of poetry. I think our conception of what counts as a short story might have changed. For me, the story fits much more into the conception of a short story, even if it is in a weird dialogue format, even if it does contain fantasy elements, the afterlife, even if it does take this turn into, the sci-fi apocalypse. I think that's relatively normal for a work of fiction, a work of prose fiction now. Whereas at the time, I think it might have been kind of groundbreaking. I've not read a lot of short stories from this time period, but maybe if we had something like Frankenstein or Camilla, which I've already read, and if those were very short, if those were condensed down, there would have been an argument at the time to consider them prose poems. So I'm interested in reading the other prose poems by Edgar Allan Poe, and the prose poem inspired, or supposedly inspired by Edgar Allan Poe that H.P. Lovecraft wrote, and finding some others. I know prose poetry is still a modern format. There are people who write prose poetry, and I think I would like to read some modern prose poems to get a better sense of it. The book itself is, the actual story itself, I think was interesting. It's very valuable from a historical perspective. I don't think too many people had written this kind of story about a meteor comes and destroys the world, and now it feels a little cliche, I think. But I think at the time it was rather groundbreaking. And I am just left with one question about the depiction of the afterlife. And it's important because it's at the very beginning. They change their names. And I'm thinking, why do they change their names? And so they both get new Greek names. And so it's Eros, which is a kind of love. It's where the word erotic comes from in English. It's not like specifically sexual. I would say probably like romantic love would be the best English translation for that concept. And Charmion means kind of joy, I believe. And so maybe it's just kind of a nice, pleasant touch. There's a horrible apocalypse, but at the end they do get to heaven, and even their names are made better and more joyful. I have to think about that for a bit. But if you'd like to continue with me on my exploration of poetry or my exploration of cosmic horror for October, reading a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stories, you can subscribe and hit the bell. But don't forget to drop me a like before you do. And remember, good night. Good day. Good potato. I don't think that was loud enough. Okay.